The government class crossed Main Street and headed east toward the river. Mr. Mount held back a step or two and listened with amusement as the boys argued back and forth, some of them using phrases and words they just heard from the real lawyers. This way, he said, and the group hung a left onto a narrow side street. They filed into Pappy's, a famous deli known for its pastrami subs and onion rings. It was 10 minutes before noon, and they had beaten the rush. They ordered quickly, then huddled around a long table near the front window. "Who is the better lawyer?" Mr. Mount asked. At least 10 answered at once, and there was an even split between Jack Hogan and Clifford Nance. Mr. Mount prodded them with questions like, which lawyer did you believe? Which would you trust? Which did the jury tend to follow? The food arrived, and the conversation dropped dramatically. "A show of hands," Mr. Mount said, "and you must vote. No fence straddling. Raise your hand if you think Mr. Duffy is guilty." He counted 10 hands. "Okay, not guilty." He counted 5 hands. "Theo, I said you must vote." "Sorry, but I can't vote. I think he's guilty, but I don't see how the state can prove its case. All they can prove is motive, maybe." "The maybe game, huh?" Mr. Mountain said. "I thought that was very effective." "I'm with Theo," Aaron said. "He sure looks guilty, but the prosecutor can't even place him at the scene of the crime. That's a problem, right?" "A large problem, I'd say," Mr. Mount replied. "What about the stolen jewelry and watches and guns?" Edward asked. "Did they find this stuff? It was never mentioned." "Don't know, but then the opening statements are somewhat limited." "They seem pretty long to me." "We'll find out when the witnesses are called," Theo added. "Who's the first witness?" Chase asked. "I haven't seen the witness list," Mr. Mount said, "but they usually start with the crime scene. It'll probably be one of the detectives." "Cool. How late can we stay today, Mr. Mount?" "We have to be back at school at 3:30. "How late will the trial go?" "Judge Gantry likes to work," Theo said, "at least until 5. "Can we come back tomorrow, Mr. Mount?" "Afraid not. It's a one-day field trip. You do have other classes, you know. None as exciting as mine, but that's just my opinion." The deli was suddenly packed, and a line formed outside. Mr. Mount told his students to finish up. Pappy, the owner, was famous for barking at people who occupied tables long after they had finished eating. They strolled along Main Street, which was busy now, with people scurrying around on their lunch breaks. At a fountain, office workers ate and talked while soaking up the sun. Officer Peacock, the ancient traffic cop, directed traffic with his worn-out whistle and yellow gloves and managed to prevent accidents, which was not always the case with Officer Peacock. Just ahead, a group of men in dark suits left a building and headed in the same direction as the students. Mr. Mount whispered loudly, "Look, men, it's Mr. Duffy and his lawyers." The boys slowed for a second, and the group of dark suits moved on in front of them. Pete Duffy, Clifford Nance, 2 other solemn-faced lawyers, and a 5th man Theo had not seen in the courtroom that morning, but one he knew well. His name was Omar Cheap, and he was not a lawyer, though he was well known in legal circles. Mr. Cheap was a former federal agent of some variety who now ran his own firm. He specialized in investigations and surveillance and other activities that lawyers needed from time to time. He and Mrs. Boone had once been involved in a nasty dispute in a divorce case, and Theo had heard Omar Chief described as an armed thug and a man who enjoyed breaking the law. Theo, of course, was not supposed to hear such comments, but then he heard a lot around the office. He had never actually met Mr. Cheap, but he'd seen him in the court. A rumor was that if Omar Cheap was working on the case, then someone had to be guilty. Omar looked directly at Theo. He was thick, powerfully built, with a large round head that he kept shaved. The man tried to look menacing, and he was successful. He turned away and hurried after Duffy. They walked down Main Street, the boys in a loose group, moving fast to keep up with the defendant and his team. Omar Cheap's hulking frame protected Pete Duffy from the rear, as if someone might take a shot. Clifford Nance told a funny story, and the men had a good laugh. Pete Duffy laughed the loudest. Guilty. Theo hated to believe this because not a single witness had testified. Plus, he liked to tell himself that he believed in the presumption of innocence. Guilty, Theo said again to himself. Why couldn't he follow the law, give Mr. Duffy the benefit of innocence? Why couldn't he do what good lawyers were supposed to do? This frustrated him as he followed along behind Mr. Duffy and his lawyers. There was something missing in the case, and based on what had already been said in court, Theo suspected that the mystery might never be solved. They filed into their seats, front row, left side of the balcony, and allowed their lunch to settle. Judge Gantry had recessed until 1 p.m., some 15 minutes away. Deputy Gossett, the old bailiff, lumbered over to them and said, "Theo." "Yes, sir. Is this your class?" "What else would it be, Deputy Gossett? A teacher, 16 students?" "Yes, sir. Judge Gantry would like to see you in chambers. And hurry, he's a busy man." Theo pointed to himself, tried to think of something to say. "The whole class," Deputy Gossett said, "and hurry." They scrambled into formation behind Deputy Gossett and hustled down the stairs. "In chambers" meant that the judge was in his office behind the bench, adjacent to the courtroom. This office was different from his formal office down the hall. It was confusing, and Theo was attempting to explain this when Deputy Gossett opened the door to a long, wood-paneled room with old portraits of old bearded judges covering the walls. Judge Gantry, without his black robe, rose from behind his desk and stepped out to meet the boys. "Hello, Theo," he said, embarrassing Theo slightly. The other two students were too awestruck to speak. "And you must be Mr. Mount," the judge was saying as they shook hands. "Yes, Judge, and this is my 8th grade government class." Since there were not enough seats for everyone, Judge Gantry addressed the boys where they stood. "Thank you for coming. It's important for students to see our judicial system in action. What do you think so far?" All 16 boys were mute. What were they supposed to say? Mr. Mount rescued them. "They're fascinated by the trial," he said. "We just debriefed over lunch, rated the lawyers, talked about the jurors, and had a lot of opinions about guilt and innocence." "I won't ask, but we have a couple of pretty good lawyers, don't you think?" All 16 heads nodded. "Is it true that Theo Boone actually gives legal advice?" A few nervous laughs. Theo was both embarrassed and proud. "Yes, but I don't charge them anything," he said. A few more laughs. "Any questions about the trial?" Judge Gantry asked. "Yes, sir," Brandon said. "On television, you always see a surprise witness that comes out of nowhere and changes the trial. Is there a chance of a surprise witness here? If not, it seems like the state has a pretty weak case." "Good question, son. The answer is no. Our rules of procedure prohibit surprise witnesses. Television gets it all wrong. In real life, before the trial starts, each side must provide a list of all potential witnesses." "Who's the first witness?" Jarvis asked. "The victim's sister, the lady who found the body. She'll be followed by the homicide detectives." "How long can you stay today?" "We need to be back at school at 3:30, Mr. Mount said. "Okay, I'll call a recess at 3 and you can ease out. How are the seats up in the balcony?" "Great, and thank you." "I've moved you down to the floor. Things have cleared out a bit. Again, thanks for taking such an interest in our judicial system. It's very important to good government." With that, Judge Gantry was finished. The students thanked him. He and Mr. Mount shook hands again. Deputy Gossett led them out of chambers, back to the courtroom, down the main aisle, and to the second row behind the prosecution's table. In front of them were 2 young men who had been introduced as Mrs. Duffy's sons. The lawyers were only a few feet away. Across the aisle, Omar was now sitting behind Pete Duffy, his black eyes darting around the courtroom as if he might need to shoot someone. Once again, he looked directly at Theo. They had gone from the cheap seats to ringside, and they couldn't believe it. Chase, the mad scientist, was to Theo's right, elbow to elbow. He whispered, "Did you pull some strings, Theo?" "No, but Judge Gantry and I are pretty tight." "Nice work." At precisely 1 p.m., the bailiff stood and wailed, "Court is now in session. Please remain seated." Judge Gantry appeared in his robe and took his seat. He looked at Jack Hogan and said, "The state may call its first witness." From a side door, another bailiff escorted a well-dressed lady into the courtroom and to the witness chair. She placed her hand on a Bible and swore to tell the truth. When she was seated and the microphone adjusted, Mr. Hogan began his direct examination. Her name was Emily Green, the sister of Myra Duffy. She was 44, lived in Strattonburg, worked as a fitness counselor, and on the day of the murder she had done exactly what Mr. Hogan described in his opening statement. When her sister didn't show for lunch and didn't call, she became worried, then panicky. She called her repeatedly on her cell phone, then raced to Waverly Creek to the Duffy home and found her sister dead on the living room carpet. It was obvious, at least to Theo, that Mr. Hogan and Miss Green had carefully rehearsed their testimony. It was designed to establish death and to evoke sympathy. When they finished, Clifford Nance stood and announced that he had no questions on cross-examination. Miss Green was excused, and she took a seat in the front row next to her 2 nephews, directly in front of Mr. Mount's students. The next witness was Detective Crone from Homicide. Using the large screen and the projector, he and Jack Hogan laid out the neighborhood, the Duffy home, and the crime scene. Several important facts were established, though the jury already knew them. The front door was open, the rear door and the side patio door were not locked. The alarm system was not engaged. And new facts emerged. Fingerprint tests found matches throughout the house for Mr.